If you think New York and Houston are the best cities to survive a zombie outbreak, you're wrong. In this video, I ranked 6 major cities by your actual survival odds. And what makes a city deadly isn't what you think. Like, I know New York always shows up on those best zombie survival city lists because of the sheer number of resources, but that's high-key the most dangerous assumption you could make. The real horror isn't the zombies, it's the 8.3 million people trying to escape at the same time you are. What makes New York uniquely deadly is the infrastructure trap. You've got bridges, tunnels, and subways as your only exit routes, and every single one becomes a choke point within minutes. The George Washington Bridge, gridlocked. The Lincoln Tunnel, a tomb. By the time the outbreak hits hour 3, you're not dealing with an evacuation. You're dealing with the largest human stampede in history, and the zombies are just following the noise.
Hands down, the biggest killer in New York won't be zombies. It'll be other people. We're talking about a population density of 27,000 people per square mile, all competing for the same resources. That bodega you're running to, 50 other people had the same idea, and at least 10 of them are armed. This is low-key a battle royale situation before the zombies even become your primary problem. And here's what nobody talks about: vertical survival. You're in a city of skyscrapers, which means elevators stop working when the power grid fails. Hours 6 to 8, realistically. If you're above the 10th floor, you're either trapped or you're doing cardio that'll make you zombie bait from exhaustion alone. If you're street level, you're in the flood zone when the horde moves through Manhattan. The water situation is actually fascinating in the worst way. New York's water comes from upstate reservoirs through aqueducts. It's gravity-fed, so it'll keep flowing even without power. But here's the catch. By hour 12, you've got 8 million people with the same realization, and every water source becomes a conflict zone. The Hudson and East Rivers, contaminated with runoff, and let's be real, probably zombie fluids by day 2.
Los Angeles isn't just big, it's 503 square miles of urban sprawl, with a car-dependent infrastructure that becomes your worst enemy the second traffic stops moving. And traffic will stop moving. We're talking about a city where people already spend 119 hours a year in traffic jams during normal times. What makes LA particularly brutal is the illusion of escape routes. You see all those highways, the 405, the 101, the 10, and you think you've got options. But by the time you realize everyone's on the same highway, you're in a parking lot, surrounded by zombies who are just walking between cars like it's a buffet line. The real genius of LA's design is that it traps you while making you feel like you're mobile. This is where environmental factors become your secondary killer. LA's climate means you're dealing with dehydration as a constant threat. You've got maybe 72 hours before water becomes more valuable than ammunition. The Los Angeles aqueduct brings water from the Eastern Sierra, but once the pumping stations lose power, that's done. You're left with whatever's in swimming pools and water heaters, and you're competing with 4 million other people for it. Fire is the other nightmare scenario nobody's prepping for. LA's dry climate, plus abandoned cars, plus potential electrical fires from the grid failing, equals firestorms that spread faster than you can run. By hour 18, you could have entire neighborhoods burning, which funnels both zombies and survivors into increasingly smaller safe zones. Like, you're not just running from the undead, you're running from walls of flame that are herding you like cattle. And let's talk about the homeless population for a second, because this is where it gets ethically complicated, but survival critical. LA has over 40,000 unhoused people who already know how to survive in urban environments without traditional resources. They know where the water caches are, which buildings have unlocked access, and how to move unseen. In a zombie outbreak, that knowledge makes them either your greatest allies or your most dangerous competitors, depending on how the first 24 hours shake out.
Chicago's got one massive advantage that bumps it up this list: Lake Michigan. You've got a virtually unlimited fresh water source on your eastern border, which solves the single biggest survival problem. But here's the contrarian take. That lake is also a trap that concentrates the population. What makes Chicago interesting is the geographic bottleneck. You've got water on one side and urban sprawl on the other 3. which means zombie hordes get funneled into predictable patterns. If you understand the city's layout,
You can use the Chicago River and its branches as natural barriers. But if you don't, you're getting pushed toward the lake with everyone else. And by hour 20, the entire shoreline is a war zone. This is low-key the most underrated variable in zombie survival. If the outbreak happens between November and March, Chicago's weather becomes either your best friend or your executioner. Zombies in freezing temperatures. Do they slow down? Do they freeze solid? Nobody knows. But you're also dealing with hypothermia as a survival threat. The average January temperature is 26 degrees Fahrenheit, which means you need shelter, heat, and insulation, all while avoiding the undead. The real horror isn't the cold though, it's the infrastructure collapse in winter. Chicago's buildings rely on centralized heating systems that fail when the power grid goes down. By hour 36, you're dealing with frozen pipes, no heat, and the choice between freezing to death in a secure location or risking exposure to find somewhere warm. And those warming shelters the city has, everyone knows about them, which makes them zombie magnets. The L-train system is another double-edged sword. The elevated tracks mean you can potentially move above street-level zombie hordes, but once the power's out, you're walking on narrow platforms with nowhere to go if you encounter a horde. The subway sections become tombs, literally. Dark, enclosed spaces, where sound echoes and attracts every zombie in a 3-block radius.
Denver's where we start seeing actual survivability, and it's because of one key factor. It's a mid-sized city, population 715,000, with immediate access to wilderness. You can be in the Rocky Mountains in 30 minutes under normal conditions, which means you've got an escape route that doesn't involve competing with millions of people. But here's what makes Denver tricky: altitude. At 5,280 feet, you're dealing with thinner air, which affects both your physical performance and your decision-making if you're not acclimated. If you're a sea-level resident visiting Denver when the outbreak hits, you're already at a 20% performance disadvantage. You tire faster, you think slower, and zombies don't care about your oxygen saturation levels. What makes Denver genuinely interesting is the topography. The city slopes upward toward the mountains, which means zombie hordes naturally flow downhill. If you can get to higher ground, literally, you're forcing the undead to work against gravity. It's not much, but in a 24-hour survival scenario, every advantage compounds. Water's less of an immediate crisis here because of the South Platte River and the mountain snowmelt. But Colorado's semi-arid climate means you're still looking at dehydration as a major threat by day 3. The real genius move in Denver is heading to one of the many REI or outdoor supply stores before everyone else realizes that camping gear is more valuable than guns. A water filter, a tent, and a sleeping bag rated for mountain temperatures, that's your survival kit right there. The other threat you're not considering: wildlife. If you escape to the mountains, you're in bear and mountain lion territory. You're also at risk for altitude sickness if you climb too high too fast. By the time you're at 10,000 feet, you're dealing with potential pulmonary edema, which can kill you just as dead as a zombie bite. The mountains offer safety, but they demand respect and preparation. Boise is the city nobody thinks about, and that's exactly why it ranks this high. Population 235,000. That's small enough that evacuation is actually possible, but large enough that you have infrastructure and resources. You've got the Boise River for water, immediate access to high desert and mountains for escape routes, and a population that's already outdoors oriented. What makes Boise genuinely brilliant for zombie survival is the space-to-people ratio. Idaho has 19 people per square mile, compared to New Jersey's 1,207, which means the zombie density is inherently lower. By the time the outbreak spreads to Boise, you've likely had warning from coastal cities, giving you a 12 to 24-hour head start on preparation. The gun culture factor. This is where we need to talk about something uncomfortable but survival critical. Idaho has some of the most permissive gun laws in the US and a high rate of gun ownership. In a zombie outbreak, that's a double-edged sword. On one hand, you've got an armed population capable of defense. On the other hand, you've got armed conflicts over resources. The first 24 hours will determine whether Boise's gun culture becomes a community defense asset or a civil war catalyst. The real genius of Boise is the agricultural access.
You're in a state with massive potato farms, cattle ranches, and grain production. Within a 50-mile radius, you've got enough food production to sustain a population if you can secure it. The challenge is getting out of the city and to those resources before they're claimed or destroyed. The threat you're not expecting? Isolation. Boise's remoteness is an advantage for avoiding initial infection, but it's a disadvantage for long-term survival. You're far from major supply chains, which means once local resources are depleted, resupply is nearly impossible. You're also dealing with harsh winters, average January low 23 degrees Fahrenheit, that require significant preparation.
Anchorage is hands down the highest survival odds on this list, and it's because of one brutal reality. Zombies don't do well in extreme cold, and neither do most people, which means lower population density and natural environmental barriers. What makes Anchorage uniquely survivable is the combination of isolation, low population, 291,000, and a culture that's already built around self-sufficiency. Alaskans know how to hunt, fish, preserve food, and survive in conditions that would kill most Americans within 48 hours. This isn't just a survival advantage, it's a cultural immunity to the chaos that destroys other cities. The cold equation. By the time winter hits, Anchorage temperatures drop to an average of 15 degrees Fahrenheit, with extremes reaching minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. If zombies are reanimated corpses, they're subject to the same physics as any other dead tissue. They freeze. Even if they don't freeze solid, their movement slows dramatically. You're essentially dealing with a self-limiting outbreak where the environment does half your defensive work. The real challenge in Anchorage isn't the zombies, it's surviving the environment while avoiding them. You need cold weather gear, a heat source, and food stores to make it through winter. But here's the advantage. Alaskans already have this. The average Anchorage household is better prepared for infrastructure collapse than 90% of the continental US. Water is paradoxically both abundant and scarce. You're surrounded by snow and ice, but you need fuel to melt it, and fuel becomes a critical resource once supply chains break. The Chugach Mountains provide natural barriers and escape routes, but they're also deadly if you're not experienced in winter survival. The isolation advantage. Anchorage is accessible primarily by air and sea, with limited road connections to the rest of Alaska. That geographic isolation means zombie hordes from the continental US can't simply walk there. You're dealing with a contained outbreak scenario, where the initial infected population is limited, and reinforcements, zombie or human, are unlikely. The threats you're facing in Anchorage are environmental: frostbite, hypothermia, avalanches, and wildlife: bears, moose. But these are known threats with established survival protocols. You're trading the chaos of human density for the brutal honesty of nature. And in a zombie outbreak, that's a trade worth making. Here's what nobody tells you about zombie survival rankings. The city matters less than your preparation and decision-making in the first 6 hours. The real horror isn't the zombies, but the human response, the panic, the violence, the breakdown of social order. By the time you're 24 hours in, your survival odds are determined by whether you moved fast, moved smart, and moved away from population centers. What makes a city survivable isn't just resources, it's space, water access, climate, and population density. The cities that rank highest are the ones where you can escape the human chaos and establish a defensible position before the horde arrives. And if you're in New York or LA when the outbreak hits, your best bet isn't survival. It's having a plan to not be there within the first hour and establish a defensible position before the horde arrives. And if you're in New York or LA when the outbreak hits, your best bet isn't survival. It's having a plan to not be there within the first hour, because by the time everyone else realizes they need to leave, you're already too late.